If you've watched the Minions and Despicable Me movies and didn't find them funny, you might be the only person on the planet who thinks so. But did you know that even though it's one of the funniest franchises ever, there are quite a few small mistakes hidden across its 6 films?
What?
One of the main mistakes that many fans frequently point out in the Gru movie franchise is the inconsistency in the timeline between events across the films. For instance, in the first movie, when the villain goes to the orphanage, we see on his file that he was born in 1960. This makes sense because we see little Gru as a 9-year-old kid watching the moon landing on TV in 1969. However, in Minions 2, we see that this doesn't add up at all, since the movie is set in 1976 and Gru is 12 years old in the animation. The detail is that if Gru was actually born in 1960, then in 1976 he would be 16, not just 12. And this same mistake shows up again in Despicable Me 4. We see Gru attending his high school reunion for the class of 1985, as indicated by the banner welcoming the alumni. But if we ignore the mistake we just mentioned, and if Gru was 12 years old in 1976, then in 1985 he would be 21. That means he would definitely be too old to be graduating high school. Besides, Gru doesn't seem like the kind of guy who would fail 4 grades. I think he'd freeze the whole school before that happens. Check out all 15 mistakes we found in this video from the Minions and Despicable Me movies. You know what to do. Jump on board, because another Cinewave is about to start. Among the Minions and Despicable Me films, some really good animated shorts were released by Illumination. And one of my favorites is Works in Mailroom, where 2 of Gru's employees are responsible for sorting all the packages that arrive at the villain's lair. In the middle of everything that happens in the short, one of the minions turns into one of those purple monsters from Despicable Me 2, and his coworker starts laughing at his situation. And if you pay close attention, you'll notice that when Gru's minion starts laughing, the Game Boy he was holding suddenly disappears, and a bag of popcorn magically appears in his hands instead. If there's a magic trick to make popcorn appear out of nowhere, I definitely want to learn it. When we see Gru leaving his school, we notice that while many of his classmates are being picked up by their parents, Gru is met by his henchmen disguised as his family. Right after, we see the little boss hopping on his supercharged bike and taking off. But if you rewind a bit, you'll notice a small mistake in the scene. In the beginning, the bike has a kickstand holding it up when no one's on it. But when Gru gets on, we see that the kickstand magically disappears. A little continuity error in the latest Minions movie for sure. We found a pretty interesting logic error in the 2015 Minions movie. When Kevin, Stuart, and Bob sneak into the cathedral where Scarlet is being crowned as the Queen of England, it's clearly daytime, as you can see sunlight shining above the church chandelier. The funny thing is, after the Minions manage to mess up the ceremony and break out through the stained glass windows, we can see that the sun is gone, it's dark outside, and it's raining. I knew London weather could be unpredictable, but this is just too much. And since we're talking about the 3 main minions, let's give a shout out to their leader by commenting #Kevin down below. But only if you've ever laughed at the Minions. Jumping over to the second Minions movie released in 2022, where we see Gru as a young boss, there's that unforgettable scene where the Vicious 6 chases the kid and the 3 little yellow guys through the city center. At one point, we see the nun throw 2 nunchucks at our favorite villain. But when Gru dodges them and the van drives over the characters' heads, if you look closely, there's only 1 nunchuck. Where did the other weapon go? At the beginning of the first Despicable Me movie, we see that one of the Egyptian pyramids has been stolen, and an inflatable replica has been put in its place. Just before this happens, you can see several tourists at the base of the attraction, but when the scene zooms out, you'll notice that the group of tourists mysteriously disappears. This was definitely an animation error that occurred in the film, and even after all these years, some people still haven't noticed it. Now moving on to Despicable Me 3, we have to admit that 2 of the most memorable moments are when Gru meets his brother.
Drew!
And when the 2 brothers unfortunately end up fighting. However, at the end of the movie, we see Drew sneaking into Brat's giant robot and destroying the power lines feeding the ray that was about to destroy Gru. And when it's all over, our favorite villain is sad, thinking he didn't save his twin brother, but they end up reuniting and sharing an emotional hug. But if we stop to think about it, the whole ending doesn't make much sense, since Gru was unconscious when Drew entered the robot to save him, so he wouldn't know Drew was inside the giant machine when it exploded. So this is a logic flaw in the third Gru family movie. For many, Despicable Me 2 is the best movie in the franchise because it's where the love between Lucy and Gru begins, and it's in a scene involving these 2 characters that we notice a small logic error. At one point, we see Lucy attack and destroy several cupcakes in the storefront where she and her future husband husband are. We see that Gru's face is completely covered in cupcake bits, but at the same time, we can also see that the AVL agent's hands are perfectly clean, which doesn't make any sense at all, since they should be messy too, don't you think? What's interesting about this whole scene is that we see Gru wiping his face off with his signature striped scarf, but in the next scene, we can see that not only is the ex-villain's face completely clean, but the scarf itself also has no traces of the cupcake bits that Lucy smashed and scattered everywhere, adding even more to the string of errors. And if you've made it this far, there's no doubt about it, you're officially a fan of animated movies and cartoons, so you should definitely subscribe to our channel right now so you don't miss our daily videos. Going back to the first Despicable Me movie, we notice another small mistake that happens at the orphanage where the girls live before being adopted by Gru. When Margot, Edith, and Agnes return from selling cookies, they have to report to the head of the orphanage, and there's a line on the floor that the girls aren't allowed to cross without the woman's permission. What's interesting is that suddenly they're standing close to the director's desk, which doesn't make any sense since they weren't supposed to cross the line. And on top of that, when we look behind them, the line is gone. It's almost like it never existed. At one point in Despicable Me 2, we see the minion dressed as a maid answering the door for someone, who we later find out is Dr. Nefario, kidnapping the yellow creatures to inject them with his purple monster serum. Notice that when Gru's servant opens the door, it swings inward, like most doors in the world. But later in the same movie, when Agnes brings an umbrella to her father, who's sitting sadly on the steps of his house, too afraid to talk to Lucy, notice that this time the door swings outward, toward the street. Yet another logical error in the second film of the franchise. If there's one thing Agnes loves more than anything, it's unicorns. So when Edith accidentally fires a ray that disintegrates her stuffed unicorn, leaving only ashes, it was a pretty intense moment. But besides being intense, this is also a mysterious event in the movie because in the next scene, when Agnes faints from holding her breath, we can see that the ashes of the stuffed animal have simply disappeared, like magic. Did one of the minions sneak in and blow the ashes away when no one was looking? That's the only explanation. After that, Gru assigns 3 of his minions to find a new unicorn for Agnes. At the end of the night, we see the yellow creatures enter her room and notice that the minion dressed as a baby isn't holding anything in his hands. But in the next scene, we see that the same minion is holding a makeshift unicorn gift made from a toilet brush and an ice cream cone. Gru's servants are definitely masters of illusion, as they can seemingly make things appear out of nowhere. In the first Minions movie, when Kevin, Stewart, and Bob are in the audience watching Scarlet Overkill's speech, we see 3 superfans of the villain near the stage, dressed exactly like her. The detail is that when the scene zooms out, the members of Scarlet's fan club simply disappear, as there's no one dressed like her around the stage anymore. This is a small mistake we noticed in the Minions movie. But the truth is, even with these mistakes, I still love watching Gru and his family's movies, and the Minions always make me laugh. We're leaving you with 2 awesome video suggestions we picked out just for you. Just choose which one you want to watch first and click on it. See you in the next video. Until then.